In 1955, Chrysler would begin production of a new vehicle that would really set the industry ablaze for a number of years, and that was the C300 Chrysler for 1955 that you see here. This was really the first of the so-called letter series cars, and yes, it was the C300, not the 300C. Some people kind of refer to this as the 300A because in 1956, the next vehicle that would come out would be the 300B. And then, of course, the letter series would continue on, the 300C, D, all the way up to the 300L in 1965. Now, the great thing about the C300 was that under hood, it had a 331 cubic inch Hemi head V8 that made 300 horsepower, which for the time was an amazing feat. And it was also topped by two 4-barrel carburetors and was allegedly race-tuned. As the letter series would continue on, the engines would get increasingly powerful. Really, by 1957, they started having some significant power with the 392 cubic inch Hemi under hood. More specifically, that 392 cubic inch V8 made 375 horsepower in standard form or 390 horsepower in optional form. And of course, for 1957, the 300 was all new and got really the first, I would say, of its most beautiful body styles with the huge fins out back and the trapezoidal grille up front. This really was a masterpiece from Chrysler's styling team that was led by Virgil Exner. Of course, pretty much all of the 1957 Chrysler products, from Plymouth to Dodge to DeSoto to the 300s and Imperials, really looked quite spectacular. And that's a credit to, as I said, Chrysler's styling team under the Exner-Era. Unfortunately, that styling renaissance over at Chrysler would be relatively short-lived, and as time would go on, the 300 would evolve quite significantly. While in 1957 and 1958, there was the 392 cubic inch Hemi V8, in 1959, the Hemi was dropped, and the so-called Golden Lion 413 cubic inch wedge V8 would be placed under hood. While the Hemi would now be gone in favor of the Golden Lion, power was still there under hood. The Golden Lion 413 made 380 gross horsepower. And so while some people, let's say, were crying over the loss of the Hemi, in truth, the Golden Lion was a really, really nice V8, the wedge V8, and it was over 100 pounds lighter than the Hemi engine that it replaced. So not only was it similar power, but it also made the car lighter. Of course, after the 1959 model year, the 300 really started to evolve significantly. And the 300 was never really a great seller for Chrysler. It was an expensive vehicle, and they often sold in the hundreds of units, not even in the thousands of units, probably due to the expense associated with procuring one. By 1962, Chrysler actually started to introduce a non-letter series 300 into their lineup. It was kind of like the sporty variant of the lineup, not the most luxurious like the New Yorker, and not the cheapest at the bottom end of the lineup. It was kind of the mid-priced, sportier variant, and kind of diluted the 300 letter series, but still was a good car. That, as I said, was introduced for the 1962 model year. By 1964, what we're going to talk about is the subject of this video, and that is the Chrysler 300K. This is the penultimate year for the letter series Chryslers. The 300L would be the last Chrysler letter series car, at least until the 300M that came out in the late 1990s. But the L was the real, I'll call it real last letter series car, and the K was the one right before that. And here we have this beautiful rosewood poly 1964 Chrysler 300K, the last of the true Virgil Exner cars, or at least the letter series Chryslers. And in 1965, Elwood Engel would really get his only letter series Chrysler, the 300L. The car would be all new for 1965. Engel had taken over for Virgil Exner in 1962, but of course it takes a number of years before vehicles that are in design make it to the marketplace. And Engel had taken over for Exner in 1962 after Exner was fired when the full-size Chryslers that he introduced, and I should say the Chrysler lineup, including in particular the Plymouth lineup, just bombed in the marketplace. Exner, of course, blamed Chrysler management, who forced him on Plymouth as an example, and the Dodge lineup to downsize the vehicles because Chrysler leadership thought that was what General Motors was going to do. And he called those cars his plucked chickens because they were smaller than intended. Dodge had to rush in the 880 to the marketplace in order to fill the void of full-size cars. Plymouth didn't, and as a result, sales suffered commensurately. But here, as I said, we have the last of the Exner-Era letter series cars, the 300K, and finished in a beautiful color. Now, up front, you have the quad headlamps. Nothing all that distinctive about those, but they are kind of inset into a cove, a little bit like the 1961 Imperials, although certainly not nearly as deep of a cove with the pod-like freestanding headlamps. Still, a little bit similar to mine. You have this inverse trapezoidal grille that is the inverse shape of the 57. So they flipped it around, and by this point, the letter series has this crosshatch style grille. Now, interestingly, this crosshatch would remain through the 300L in 1965 when the 300M was introduced by Chrysler in 1999. And one could argue, is that really a continuation of letter series or not? It was front-wheel drive, obviously, and had a V6 underhood. But regardless, it was a letter series Chrysler, for better or worse. Chrysler did not pick back up where they left off with this crosshatch theme because Dodge had taken it by that point, and so they had to have a different front end. I'm not quite sure if Dodge took inspiration from the Chryslers like this or what, but clearly this car had a crosshatch grille before Dodge had it in the modern era. Now let's take a look at the fender as an example. You can see this shoulder that runs all the length of the fender, and the fender is quite flat. There's no fender peak here. It's almost the inverse of what you'd see on some General Motors cars with the fender peak, and then it would dip down, and then you'd have kind of a prow on the hood. Here you've got a relatively low fender. It makes the car look very, very wide up front. Maybe even the inverse trapezoidal grille helps with that illusion of width. But notice that shoulder and how wide it is at the front of the car. And look, I should say wide and horizontal. And look how the clay modelers just surfaced this. It kind of gradually twists and turns. The shoulder is pervasive across the car all the way to the rear, but it kind of twists from being a horizontal surface to much more of a vertical surface. Just a beautiful kind of feature of this car that you don't really see these twisting, turning surfaces like this anymore, and I think the modelers did a great job here. Also notice the convex surface that's formed in the sheet metal behind the headlamp nacelles and how that continues the headlamp form into the lower portion of the fender. And then it basically kind of is the leading form for the wheel arch as well. So really cool Exner-Era detail. You have, of course, the wind split molding in the middle of the car, but just the front of this looks wide for the reasons that I mentioned. That inverse trapezoidal grille, the flat fenders, the flatness of that overall hood and the fenders just lends the eye to think that this is a very wide car. And of course it is. It's a big Chrysler. But I do love that shoulder that goes all the way down the side. And aside from that, the I would say body sides are relatively clean and unbroken and relatively free of creases, aside from, of course, the lower side rocker area that tucks in. Now, as we rotate to the side of the car, we see that surface I was talking about that really formed the shoulder starting at the leading edge of the fender and continuing rearward. And because of where the light source is on this car, you can see what that surface kind of twisting from being a horizontal surface into a more vertically oriented surface does to the light. And notice that the highlight is much brighter on the front end of the car. Of course, it looks like the light source is admittedly in the sky, kind of closer to that part of the car. But still, the highlight kind of dims as it goes rearward because it's catching less of the sun, owing to, in part, that surface rotating to be more vertical. Just a beautiful detail. And you have the squircle-style wheel arches on the front and the rear, this relatively thick C-pillar, and I would say with good rake to it. And then out back, you do have kind of the first of one of the things that Elwood Engel would change versus Virgil Exner. That's that little fin that he would add that was not on the 63 300J. Engel hated the tapered look that the 300J and the Chrysler cars had with the deck lid tapered, and he didn't have enough money to change that for 1964. He would get his own all-new car for 1965, but he added and changed the quarter, added these little fins so that from the side you didn't really notice the deck lid taper. It was much more of a flat profile, and that was something that Engel liked. Now notice you have the wraparound front glass still by this time frame. You have the vent panes, and then you have kind of a curved backlight as well to complement the C-pillar. I think the C-pillar and that curved backlight is one of the best looking parts of this vehicle. The front windshield and how that vent pane kind of has this concave surface to it, or this concave line. I don't know if I care for that as much, but overall quite a handsome vehicle, especially in the side profile. And I do like what Engel did with that kind of mini fin on the quarter panel. I think it helps the overall look of the car. The 300J looks a bit insubstantial in the rear, almost like it got kinked, but the K does not look that way. I think, like I said, it looks better. And we'll show one more view of the front here, kind of front three-quarter-ish, before we rotate around to the rear three-quarter. But one thing that you notice here is the leaf springs poking out. You can see them in the picture in the rear. This car, of course, has Chrysler's ubiquitous torsion bar front, leaf spring rear suspension. It was unibody starting with 1960. That was when a lot of the Chrysler cars transitioned over to unibody. Not the Imperials, though. They would transition later. So the car is admittedly different from the previous 300 letter series cars. When they were introduced in 1955, it was body on frame, will continue as body on frame through the 1959 model year. Now here, as we rotate around to the rear three-quarter, we see another beautiful angle of this car. You notice those fins that I was mentioning that Elwood Engel had added. But beyond that, look at how that crease, or the feature line that runs from the front end of the fender all the way back to the quarter panel. Now it kind of wraps around the entire vehicle. It's a little bit less crisp. It's a little bit more of a dull radius on the deck lid, but it almost forms kind of a datum line similar to the 63 Corvette or the second gen in particular Corvair. That was something that I think really helped tie the car together, the front to rear, this crisp edge. And I actually wish the deck lid were a little bit more crisp. But overall, a really handsome look. And then you also notice that the surface beneath that crease wraps around, and you have this pretty distinctive cove. The deck lid kind of curls under, creates this cove that creates a low light in that area, adorned by some bright work, of course, and flanked on the outboard sides by the tail lamps. Just a beautiful detail how that sweeps around the entire car. Something, again, that you really don't see today, where you have some cars look like they're pieces of crumpled up origami on the body sides, but very clean, and again, wrapping around the entire vehicle, just creating this harmonious look. I think it's absolutely beautiful. And despite the fact that Exner was fired by this point, well, I think that he and his team did a great job with this one. I'll also point out that the tail lamps are kind of this double trapezoidal form, if you will. You got a trapezoid, if you bisected them on the top, a trapezoid on the bottom, so it's tying that front together with the back in terms of the grille theme. And then the trim plate in the middle there that is labeled Chrysler also has this trapezoidal theme. So the car has those trapezoids kind of on a recurring basis in a number of different places and a number of different themes. Again, just creating this harmonious look front and rear. And before we go to the interior, notice here how you have this cove that I was mentioning on the deck lid and the surface that is created as that cove kind of rotates around to the body side. Creates a beautiful low light, and you can see the deck lid here is quite shiny with the sun at probably like a 12 o'clock position or maybe a 10 or 11 o'clock position in this photo. And I think that also helps to visually slim the deck lid in the rear, so that helps accentuate the width of the car. You have that vertical dimension being relatively slim, and just like the front, you have kind of another trick for your eyes where the car kind of gets this air of width to it. I think that the fins take away from that. Maybe one of the reasons why Virgil Exner didn't want the fins, because the car, the 300J, I think looks wider at the back without them. But still, I think I prefer the fins to be there versus not. Now, let's take a look at the interior, because the interior is also a thing of beauty on these Chryslers. And the features and the finish and the theme is Just spectacular. For 1964, you got this beautiful Squircle-style wheel arch, which is kind of similar to the 1961 Imperial Squircle-style wheel, although the two-spoke center is different, as well as the horn ring. But many people know that Squircle-style steering wheels are popular today. They actually were popular for a while, particularly in the Chrysler vehicles back in the early 1960s. Now, you also notice this car is a floor shifter, a console shifter. It doesn't have the push buttons. The push buttons that you see there on the dash are for the HVAC controls. But the push buttons were starting to fall out of favor with Chrysler owners. And by 1965, they would have a conventional gear shift in their vehicles, and they would be rid of the push buttons to activate the torque flight. Now, this car is also an air conditioning equipped car. You can see those two vents in the IP. You kind of pull up those vents, and they look like they're an afterthought, but they're not. They're kind of cool. And here you can see the beautiful dash in all of its glory, the round speedometer in the front. There's no tachometer on this car. You get the vacuum gauge in the console, not a tachometer. So, well, it wasn't a sports car after all. It was a sporty car. And get that air conditioning blowing right in your face with that vent that you can see. Lots of bright work on this instrument panel. Beautifully done. Great materials. Even look at the pedal trim. Lots of bright work, even on the emergency brake. So Chrysler was really going over the top with some of these things that it had for 1964, and overall looked fantastic. Now, under hood for 1964 was still the 413 cubic inch wedge V8. It made 360 horsepower in standard form, 390 in optional form. You notice that the air cleaner doesn't have a snorkel. It just has an intake that's all the way around it, allowing the carburetor to really breathe, and you can get that full power from the 413 wedge V8. These cars are pretty peppy. I wouldn't call them fast, but plenty powerful for the era. Very smooth. The torque flight has great power delivery. And you have, by this point, you got a more conventional brake booster, which is great, as opposed to that accordion thing that Chrysler had for years in the late 1950s. And of course, you have the big V-twin style Chrysler AirTemp air conditioning compressor that did a fantastic job cooling the cabin on these. I would say second only to GM's A6 compressor, although both of those are pretty good. The Ford actually never made their own air conditioning compressor until, oh boy, maybe the 80s? They didn't for a long time. They used the Tecumseh York-style two-piston compressor. Then they actually even bought GM A6 air conditioning compressors for a period of time. But GM and Chrysler both made their own, both did a great job with HVAC, I think significantly better than Ford did, at least on the air conditioning side. But you got plenty of power, like I said, with your 300K. Not as much power as you might have had in an earlier letter series car, and oh well, but you had a great package overall and a beautiful vehicle. So what do you think of the 1964 Chrysler 300K? Do you think this was a thumbs up or thumbs down from your perspective? Let me know and put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.